There are a bunch of things that made me fall in love with Teen Titans, but I'm not sure that any of them hit as hard or as quickly as the dynamic between Robin and Slade. Even from the very first episodes of the show, it's immediately clear that, despite the nature of the series, the relationship between protagonist and antagonist isn't going to be a stereotypical comic book story, a concept that develops through multiple fantastic episodes, as through constant comparisons between the pair, the series produces a litany of fantastic moments. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through each of their interactions and discuss how, through some genuinely unreal writing and animation, Teen Titans uses the relationship between Robin and Slade to not only explore how each character ticks, but also to dive deeper into one of the main themes of the show.
If you're really so curious about my intentions, perhaps we should meet. Face to face.
The Slade appearances throughout the first 4 episodes of the show are weird to say the least. To start with the first episode in production order, pretty much nobody feels in character in Divide and Conquer, and Slade is no exception. Sure, you do get the vague outline of mastermind villain in Orange and Black Factory, and Ron Perlman does nail the voice from the very first line, but outside of that, it's hard to derive much out of this appearance, unless you really look in between the lines. If you do look in between the lines though, you can find a connection between Slade first showing up and Robin first having strife with his teammates, only finding himself able to fight back against Slade when he begins to work with them, which is pretty similar to what ends up happening at the end of the season. However, there's just too much off about Slade in this one, from his random butler to the fact that he's physically angry for some reason when Cinderblock is defeated, that it's hard to feel that they had fully planned Slade's story before writing this one. Something even stranger when you get to episode 3, Final Exam, an episode that actually aired before Divide and Conquer, and that feels like an actual setup to the Robin and Slade story. While 90% of this episode is split between introducing the eventual founding members of the High Five, while also emphasizing Robin's importance to the team, the backbone of this one is introducing the idea that Slade isn't exactly your stereotypical destroy the heroes type of villain, even if the first episode definitely made him seem that way. In fact, in both this episode and Divide and Conquer, Slade's appearance in the first 20 minutes is pretty much the same, as he sends a team to take down the Titans, only for them to ultimately fail, with the Hive members even spilling who sent them. The difference is, where Slade spent the last bit of his first appearance swearing vengeance, Final Exam sees him reveling in the fact that he's gotten exactly what he wanted. Proof that Robin is physically capable, and the idea of Slade into his future apprentice's head. This final scene is probably the first great moment of the series, as Slade watches Robin utter his name for the first time, knowing that obsession is right around the corner. Moving on, we've got one more episode left to talk about in this video that isn't fantastic, and Forces of Nature definitely isn't. And while most of this episode's quality, or lack thereof, is derived from the hilariously boring Beast Boy and Starfire stuff, the Slade appearance in this one is also definitely lacking. While the scenes of him getting Thunder and Lightning to do what he says by promising them what they're chasing is a nice peek into the torment that he's going to put Terra through, the old man disguise is just so weird, and it kind of ruins the first fight between him and Robin, especially when it only gets like 20 seconds of screen time. There is this one really interesting moment right at the end that I would be kind of remiss if I didn't bring up, which is this line from Robin in response to Cyborg asking why Slade wanted to destroy the city.
I don't know, but I will find out, and he won't get away with it.
If you didn't catch it, it takes exactly one interaction with Slade before Robin slips into using I instead of we when talking about catching him, as after he personally failed to take him down in this episode, he sees all of the damage that Slade causes from this point on to be his fault, and every day that he doesn't catch him, this feeling gets worse. There's a 4-episode gap before this plot is brought up again, and I actually think this works really well to justify the difference in Robin's mentality by the time that Slade shows up again. Going into this episode, it's presumably been at least a month since he started messing with the Titans. And as Robin points out, they've pretty much got nothing when it comes to figuring out who Slade actually is, or how they can actually stop him. And it's this mentality that fuels the next 22 minutes, as Robin finds his brain more and more occupied by just one thing: stopping the one villain who's still evading him. This is something that is made apparent by the beginning of the best episode up until this point of the series. Something that Masks shares with the other 3 main episodes this video is going to focus on, as we open up to the best fight up until this point of the show. Something this episode shares with itself in about 20 minutes. And while I do love the synergy within the team that somehow feels perfected less than 10 episodes into the show, the first of the many fantastic shots in this one comes at the end of the fight, as Robin is forced to choose between chasing after the Slade bot or saving his teammate, ultimately finding himself torn in 2 directions. And while Robin doesn't let Starfire die, he certainly doesn't seem nearly as interested in whether or not she's actually okay as he is in trying to unmask one of his opponents, something that doesn't exactly bear fruit. Speaking of which, when the show cuts back to the tower, the idea of Robin becoming more interested in solving the case rather than preserving his relationships continues to become more and more apparent, as he shuts down any attempt to include him in movie night, telling Star that every second that he doesn't stop Slade is another second where something bad could happen, including what almost happened to her. This idea of Robin justifying prioritizing crime over his friends is obviously a theme that's explored all throughout this arc, starting about 11 seconds later. And while it is hard to justify how good of a twist Red X is on my 20th or whatever watch of this episode, I think it's pretty fair to say that, at least to the average viewer over the age of 11, that you can probably figure out who he is before he takes off the mask. And even if you somehow couldn't, by revealing the truth to the audience before anybody else finds out, the show makes it pretty clear that the quote-unquote twist of this episode isn't that Robin was able to become a super cool supervillain with neat gadgets and stuff. The twist is that Robin was willing to do it, and was willing to hurt his friends in that process. Sure, he does once again choose to not let one of them die, but he has no problem roughing each one of them up a fair bit, and allowing them to fight battles they have no chance of winning. Going back a little bit, something interesting about the middle chunk of this episode is that, while Robin being Red X is pretty obvious to the audience, given the voice and the shape and the everything else, it's also kind of implied that it's something that's pretty apparent to anybody in universe who's actually paying attention. Something that reflects a little bit differently on all 3 parties in this episode. For Slade, it's more or less just more confirmation that he's not exactly on the same intellectual level of the guys that he hires. For Robin's teammates, and especially Star, it's representative of the benefit of the doubt that they gave him before this incident, as none of them even consider the possibility of their leader doing something like this to them. Something that Robin will obviously lose by the end of this episode, and something that, as we'll continue to discuss, he never really gets back. And finally, for the main character of this episode, the idea that our usual super detective Robin doesn't realize how unbelievably bad this plan is further proof that, despite how much Star might protest it, Robin is starting to lose his grip. Speaking of which, even with Slade being more than aware of Robin's super sneaky plan, it does still ultimately allow him to have his first realish conversation with the guy he's been chasing, as we get some really interesting dialogue before Slade reveals his knowledge of the truth. Most of which directly hinting at Slade's desire to have Robin as a sidekick. The fight that follows this interaction is just out of this world too, pretty easily snatching the title of best up until this point of the series from 15 minutes ago, as there's just a bunch of truly fantastic shots spread throughout some fantastic choreography as the pair battle atop the buildings of Jump City, with the show taking the time to hammer in the point that despite having quite different silhouettes, these two characters fight in a very similar way. Of course, in retrospect, this fight pretty clearly shows Slade continuing to test Robin, protecting him from any serious long-term damage, and just, in general, making sure that his future apprentice is fit for the role. On the other hand, Robin is busy being blinded by the potential of catching Slade, finding himself on the verge of death with no real information on what the villain is planning, and a team worth of friends ready to unleash a barrage of criticism onto his detective tactics. Except for Starfire, that is, who, instead of lashing out, just seems disappointed that her leader didn't trust the team enough to go along with his plan, that her friend would do something like this. This episode ends with the first of what's probably only 20 or 30 times that the show will mention that Robin and Slade are very similar. And while this idea is probably pushed a bit too much, it is really interesting to see how each of these characters approach conflict, both physically and mentally, and how those different strategies parallel one another. This is something that is expanded upon pretty heavily in the next couple of episodes, but as for the end of this one, it's clear that the only outcomes of the Red X experiment, at least for this season, is Robin getting more Slade crazy, Slade getting confirmation that he's got his guy, and the rest of the Teen Titans getting confirmation that Robin is willing to do whatever it takes to get his.
Don't you ever compare me to him. He's trying to destroy the city. I'm trying to save it.
The first chunk of Apprentice Part 1 is focused on the aftermath of the previous episode on both Robin and his teammates, starting with the former and starting with what is also the best fight up until this point of the show. And while a good chunk of that comes from the absolute gorgeous visuals of this brawl against the purple sky, or the ridiculously kick-ass soundtrack that turns Robin's signature guitar sound into something that feels slightly uneasy, the largest contributor to just how terrific this first scene is how the fight as a whole feels representative of Robin's pursuit of Slade. Throughout this entire encounter, it feels like Robin can never land any real hits on his opponent, as any attempts to do so just destroy the environment around him. And at the end of it all, Robin only accomplishes two things. He's hurt his friends, as symbolized through their crumbling statues, and he's learned just how similar he is to his opponent, staring into his own eyes under Slade's mask. And as a whole, besides just being this sick opener to the finale, what this dream sequence really highlights, especially given Robin's expression upon waking up, is just how much not being able to track down Slade is truly destroying his psyche, something that bleeds throughout the next 40 minutes. The initial Slade plot in this one, with the Chronoton detonator or whatever, just isn't that interesting to talk about, since it's pretty much just a bunch of science gibberish to push the story forward, with the only interesting part really being how Robin seems to kind of want Slade to respect him in a weird way. So let's go ahead and just skip a tiny bit to Cyborg and Beast Boy trying to convince Robin to leave the Slade busting to them, a proposition that obviously isn't received very well. Something that won't exactly become clear for a few more seasons, but is definitely present in the scene, is the idea that, while Starfire is certainly the Teen Titan who is closest to Robin, it's hard to make an argument that anybody understands him as well as Raven does. Something reflected in the fact that she's the only one who doesn't waste any time trying to convince him to not chase after Slade, and instead just points him in the right direction. And while a lot of the fight scenes that I'm going to talk about in this video are somewhat subtle in what they're trying to express, such as stuff like Slade and Robin getting off the ground in the exact same way, it's probably not hard for any viewer to figure out exactly what's being shown when Robin, instead of just sinking into the general rhythm of a Titans versus a Horde fight, instead just single-handedly demolishes every single Slade bot, finding himself unable to stop until he's physically restrained. This idea is then continued, as Robin roughs up a random passerby while looking for a lead, an interaction that culminates with Beast Boy calling him out for acting like Slade, something that Robin can't help but snap at, as deep down, as seen through his own dream, he's definitely starting to recognize it too. And it's coming off the heels of this interaction that Robin is grabbed by Cinderblock and separated from his team. And while this fight does continue the idea that Robin has become overly aggressive in his pursuit of Slade, it's really just the catalyst for setting up the first face-to-face interaction between the pair, this time with no funky disguises and no robot shenanigans. And while it is a little bit unfortunate that this moment is constantly cut with the other 4 Titans and their pretty goofy subplot, even that doesn't really change the fact that this interaction feels like the culmination of everything that Slade has been doing throughout this entire season, as he finds the exact amount of effort required to make the fight even, keeping Robin at his absolute limit, all while Slade hammers in their shared fear of losing. Eventually though, Slade once again lets his opponent quote-unquote win, only to then finally reveal his plan for Robin to be his apprentice. Something that he plans to accomplish with the threat of activating the newly planted probes in the rest of the Titans, something that Robin immediately succumbs to. And while we watch our main character suit up in the colors of the villain, with his friends on the surface being completely unaware of what's happening to their leader, Slade promises that, even though he's going to fight it, Robin will eventually love working for his new master. Moving on to part 2. Nowadays, if you were to watch this show on most platforms, including HBO Max, then you won't get to watch this cold open for some reason, as it's cut in the majority of releases. And while you can probably piece together everything if you watched a version of this episode that starts after the intro, you do miss a key detail, which is the fact that what Robin is stealing is the thermal blaster that Slade then gives back to him. Something that permeates throughout this entire episode, especially in the dialogue between this video's title characters, is Slade's knowledge that this type of arrangement can't last forever, and that if he plans on keeping Robin as his apprentice long term, then he's eventually going to have to get him to somewhat want to do it. Something that he aims to accomplish by both getting him to feel more connected to his current gig, such as using what he steals to steal more, and by cutting ties to his old life, most obviously with the Titans, and a little bit with a character that we'll get to in a second. Anyway, speaking of Slade and Robin's dialogue, we probably get the most interesting pieces of it, at least from this season, right after the Titans figure out that Robin's working for Slade. First of all, we get the continuation of this arc's favorite comparison, although this time, instead of it being about how they're both determined or serious or hate to lose or whatever, it's instead perverted by Slade, as he compares Robin's attempts to take him down to his own ruthlessness. Obviously, you aren't supposed to take Slade's word at face value here, as some kind of confirmation that deep down Robin is a bad guy, why, but instead it's really more of a reflection of just how far Robin has gone in trying to get himself out of the situation, throwing himself blindly at Slade in retaliation for this statement. But even with this cool moment, it's actually the other two lines from Slade here that I think are more interesting to talk about, starting with the revelation that, according to his biometrics, Robin somewhat enjoyed the thrill of stealing. And while this statement could definitely just be Slade lying to get into Robin's head, it actually lines up pretty well with what we know about his character, especially from his time as Red X. The idea that Robin didn't enjoy sneaking around as a supervillain and coming up with cool ways to take down all of his friends is kind of ridiculous given the extent that he goes to, as it's pretty clear that the same thrill that Robin gets from fighting crime is somewhat replicated when committing it. The final part of this conversation that's worth discussing brings up a different comparison to talk about, as after Slade brings up the idea of him becoming somewhat of a father figure to Robin, the camera pans to Bats, something that is immediately supported by the next fight conveniently taking place on a Wayne Enterprises building. Of course, you could see this as just a cool reference or an indication of the life that Slade is forcing Robin to leave, or you can see this as a comparison between Slade and Batman, two characters that took Robin in and, to various levels of success, tried to raise Robin to fight with their values in mind. Now, obviously, this is not meant to be an actually Batman is just as bad as Slade moment, but there is an interesting discussion to be had about the fact that, especially if you consider that our Robin, who's pretty conclusively Dick Grayson, was just a little kid when he began fighting alongside Bruce, that perhaps these two situations aren't entirely different. Anyway, moving to that fight atop Wayne Enterprises, while it is fun to watch Robin fight his team, especially in the way that none of them really want to hurt each other, the really interesting bit comes with this absolutely gorgeous shot of Robin and Star, as she tells Robin that a world where he's evil isn't a world that she wants to live in. This statement immediately just destroys Robin, as he can't help but break his command and try to explain what's going on, only for Slade to immediately push the button. And while this doesn't just instantaneously kill Star and the others, something that was kind of implied before, it's just such an unexpected villainous moment from the show, as Slade does what most antagonists won't, and actually pulls the trigger. Of course though, Slade knows that he can't get rid of the one source of control that he has over Robin, allowing them to live under one condition. Robin attacks with everything he's got. There's one more fight to talk about from this season between Robin and Slade, and while it might not be as flashy as some of the ones I've talked about before, the final confrontation genuinely feels like the culmination of every single idea that is running through this arc. For starters, and I know I've mentioned this about a bajillion times, but there just isn't a better visual representation of the similarities between this pair than in this fight, as they even give both characters a staff so that we can see them fight in the same way with those two. There's also more of Slade not really treating these fights like an actual threat, this one even resulting in his mask beginning to crack, a taste of the cost that his arrogance will quickly have. This one also continues the idea of Slade wanting Robin to look up to him, ending with a request for him to start calling him Master, promising to teach Robin gratitude. This entire fight is filled with some really great moments, from the part where it begins to feel like a horror movie to Robin throwing the Slade logo into the ground, but let's go ahead and get into what comes immediately after, as in what gets Robin out of this situation, and ultimately what the key difference between him and Slade is. This is a point that is repeated in a more direct way in the conversation between Robin and Star at the end of this episode, but while it was Robin's connection to his friends that kept him under Slade's control, it was their connection to him that ultimately gave him an opportunity to escape it. And while the actual mechanics of the ending of this arc are really clever, with Robin tying his fate to the fate of his friends, it's the fact that it actually works that provides this really interesting look into Slade's psyche, as he just passes on this opportunity to completely wipe out the Titans. If Slade Slade just stands still for another minute or two, then seemingly the only heroes who protect Jump City would be no more. And yet, despite this, he chooses to let them go, even though he knows that it's setting up a fight that he ultimately had no chance of winning. Speaking of which, after this final showdown between Slade and all 5 Titans, a fight that can perhaps be better described as a thrashing, under Slade's mask, we see a bit of his face. A face that closely resembles Robin, and perhaps the best reminder that, despite his robotic exterior and the cold, calculated nature of the character, Slade is still a human. A human with emotions that cause him to make mistakes. The idea that Robin could still possibly become his apprentice is something that Slade drops at some point in between seasons. But for this moment, some part of him just refuses to accept the reality that, no matter how much he hates it, Slade has lost. But that doesn't mean that he's done trying to find an apprentice.
If you've stopped me, then why am I still here?
If you were expecting the show to immediately expand on the aftermath of these events, then you'll be disappointed. And by disappointed, I mean that you'll be rewarded with probably the best story that this show ever tells. Seriously though, while Slade and Robin are both characters in Tara's arc, with them even technically having a fight at some point, there's just very little interaction between these two characters here, with pretty much everything being in the second episode of the story, Titan Rising. Even here, it's mostly just stuff like Slade knowing that Robin will become obsessed with trying to figure out his plans, with some pretty good, albeit somewhat shallow, conversation between the pair. Really, and I'll save most discussion at this point for the Tara video that I'll inevitably make, but the most interesting part of the Robin and Slade dynamic that's explored here is how Slade handles recruiting Tara in comparison to his first apprentice. And while some of this comes from the fact that Tara was simply significantly more susceptible to emotional manipulation, it also highlights the things that Slade did that were specifically to target Robin, such as partaking in the constant brawls, and the fact that he made constant comparisons to himself. Anyway, Teen Titans Season 2 adaptation of the Judas Contract impresses me more and more every time I watch it, and I promise I'll cover it in this style if this video doesn't completely bomb, but it really doesn't do much for what this video is actually about. Moving on, originally this video was going to contain a full deep dive on X, since it is a direct follow-up to Masks, but I really don't think that the vast majority of it really applies to Slade and Robin's dynamic. There are a few broad strokes that I do want to hit though, starting with the immediate immense guilt that Robin feels for his decision to become Red X, somehow having even more consequences. This is something that is portrayed in a couple of really interesting ways, from the film noir-esque monologues to this absolutely gorgeous retelling of Masks but from Robin's perspective, as you get this idea that Robin still hasn't forgiven himself for what happened. Similarly, this episode also heavily foreshadows the final episode that we're going to do a deep dive on today, as we get to see what parts of Robin have changed since the first season, such as the fact that he doesn't snap at Beast Boy this time, and what parts of Robin are still the same, as he decides to mostly go solo to stop Red X, sinking very easily back into saying I instead of we. And while X does unfortunately abandon most of its cool ideas and tone to settle into a pretty boring ending, it does offer some insight into how Robin is doing in a world without Slade, right before that comes to an end. Kinda. Alright, before we get into this episode, let's quickly address two things that kind of dictate how I'm going to talk about the final full episode of Slade and Robin, Haunted. For starters, as I've mentioned before, there is no Slade in this episode, as the entirety of his appearance is conjured by Robin. Thus, while we do get a ton of insight into the dynamic from Robin's perspective, technically, besides the fact that Slade was evil enough to set up this trap, there really isn't much about the supervillain in this episode. The second thing that I wanted to mention before diving into things is that while I'm only going to talk about it for about 5 minutes and I'm almost entirely going to focus on the dialogue, this episode is just ridiculously good, and I'm definitely going to accidentally neglect to mention like a dozen fantastic things about it. Seriously, besides the ultra controversial finale, this is my favorite episode to come out of one of my favorite shows, and you could genuinely go on for like an hour about all of the things that these 22 minutes truly excel at. Anyway, enough trying to mitigate the amount of people yelling at me in the comments, let's go ahead and dive into Haunted. Kicking off with Robin, even before he inhales the chemicals from the mask, already staying up late looking for Slade. The fact that this episode comes immediately after X is not a coincidence, as with a reason for Slade to enter Robin's mind, he finds it impossible to get him out. And after a great cinderblock fight, a character intrinsically linked to the villain, and one of the finest of this episode's bajillion great shots, Slade, as thought of by Robin, enters the episode. Before getting to some of the best written dialogue that I've ever covered on this channel, let's go ahead and cover some of the visual hints of this episode's twist, as there are both some pretty unsubtle ones, like Slade not getting wet or shaking any tree branches, to some that took me a couple of watches at least. Such as the fact that not only are the supposed seismic generators at the places that Robin was watching at the beginning of the episode, but Hallucination Slade doesn't even bring up the locations before Robin starts to make them up. I'm not kidding when I say that literally everything about this episode is brilliant. Speaking of the brilliance in this episode, I want to take some time to specifically talk about the lines of dialogue from Slade in this episode and how they reflect on the guy imagining them. I'm going to put whatever lines I'm talking about on screen, so if you're watching this video in a different tab, then you might want to click over. Anyway, moving on. The first category of Slade line to talk about are the ones where he brings up the fact that Robin never really beat him. In their first couple of interactions, Slade obviously wins. At the end of Apprentice Part 2, Robin has to threaten to kill himself in order to get away, and in Aftershocks Part 2, it's Tara who ends up being the one to bring Slade to his knees. And while Robin is obviously glad that Slade isn't causing trouble anymore, there's seemingly a part of him deep down that regrets the fact that he didn't, and never will, take him down himself. Next up, in a similar vein, Slade also has a couple of statements that imply the fact that, without a Slade to fight, Robin fears that it's making him weaker. He's well aware of the fact that fighting such an elite villain made him into a better hero, so therefore he believes that the lack of that elite villain must be making him worse. Moving on, we've also got a few lines that more so reflect on the state of psychosis that Robin is settling into, as he imagines Slade saying things that just don't make sense, such as when he's trying to explain how only Robin can see him, and yet the entire time, Robin just nods along. There are also a few lines that directly bring up the rest of the Titans, such as the fact, as Robin genuinely believed during his time as Red X, that none of them can fight Slade in the same way that he can. He believes that Slade is his burden and that nobody else will ever truly understand. And finally, something that permeates throughout all of Haunted is the idea that Slade, especially in this episode, represents fear, as it gets stronger in the dark and when you're away from friends. So, of course, this episode includes a few ridiculously well-written lines about that too. Even though Slade technically isn't in this episode, all of the dialogue, especially since Ron Perlman probably has his best episode, still hits extremely hard, as it's honestly the first half hour that I think of when I think of the villain, as it shows the immense impact that he had on our main character. Speaking of which, let's talk about how Robin deals with the situation. which, in a few words, is not very well. While it's a bit hard to fully disconnect the effects of the chemicals from what Robin does in this episode, I think it's fair to say that a lot of this, as unflattering as it is just Robin. The snapping at Starfire, the abandoning of the group, the part of the episode where he literally threatens to quote-unquote take down his teammates. Yeah, Robin hasn't quite gotten over the parts of himself that first caused him to become Red X. Skipping ahead quite a bit, there's something kind of beautifully melancholic about the way this episode ends. As where Apprentice Part 2 finishes with a message about the power of friendship, Haunted ends with Robin just getting through this incident and accepting that his past with Slade will be something that always bothers him. Unlike the end of a good chunk of episodes of this show, there just isn't any type of magical solution. And in an episode that is filled with great attributes, that's perhaps my favorite. And while the plot of this one is obviously more than supernatural, there's just something so intrinsically real about this story, and especially its resolution, as we get this deep dive into the long-term psychological problems that Robin will always have as a result of the show's first season, and how those problems, if not handled correctly, can and will destroy the relationships that he has with those around him. More so than anything else, Slade spends the Apprentice two-parter hoping that Robin would stop being so close to his friends, and in death, he gets closer than he ever did before.
This doesn't change anything. If I ever see you again.
I wouldn't expect anything less.
Haunted is obviously the perfect cap to Slade and Robin's dynamic. And as you watch Raven's arc in the 4th season, it kinda seems like it's going to be. It's very much a Terra situation, as the suddenly revived Slade is more focused on Raven, and only manages to fit in tiny interactions with Robin. There are definitely a few great moments between the pair in his first couple of episodes back though. From Robin being completely terrified yet completely ready, to Slade obviously being more interested in his first apprentice than he is in Raven, to him knowing that Robin would go crazy to try to figure out the mark of Scath, and my favorite being this line that feels especially apt:
You can't always have what you want, Robin.
But by and large, this arc is pretty void of Robin and Slade moments. That is, until the second part of the finale, where the show provides, in a definite bit of fan service, the perfect reflection on the dynamic between these characters. In the end part 2, fittingly during the end of the world, we get our final interaction between Slade and Robin, as they team up and journey through Trigon's eternity. And every single thing about these 7 or so minutes feels like the summation of these two characters. For starters, even the reason that both of them are willing to team up with the enemy are inherently reflective of their characters, as Robin is trying to save Raven and Slade is trying to save himself. Also, and it's actually been like 10 minutes since I last brought it up, but during the couple of fights during this section, Robin and Slade don't just fight similarly, they fight exactly the same. Anyway, getting into their last couple of conversations, they start with a discussion of Slade's impact towards creating the hellish landscape that they're currently fighting in, which actually leads to this really interesting conversation. On the one hand, Robin is entirely right, and Slade did, once again, choose himself over anybody else, hurting others while improving his own situation. On the other hand, Slade is also right, as Trigon was going to do this anyway, and there was no reason for Slade to not take advantage of the situation. He didn't actually make things worse. This obviously correlates with the somebody is always going to commit crime, might as well be me mindset that multiple villains, including Slade, seem to have in this show. And seeing these two characters discuss that creates this really interesting moment. After a few great fight scenes, and a full explanation of what Slade is after, we finally arrive at the last conversation, which is also hopefully conveniently on screen. After we got a bunch of fights between this pair in this show, it's hard to not really appreciate the fact that the final interaction between this pair isn't another fight, but instead a promise to continue fighting. Throughout the show, there is obviously a lot of focus put onto the fact that Robin is indeed obsessed with Slade, something backed up here by him seeming somewhat disappointed by the lack of a double cross. But that obsession is a two-way street. There's still a part of the villain that refuses to admit that he lost all the way back in Apprentice Part 2, as in this episode, that part of him definitely enjoys fighting alongside Robin. Something that makes sense given the fact that that's all he ever wanted. The final shot featuring both of these characters sees each one going down a different path after a similar journey. And ultimately, I'm not sure if you could create a better representation of their series-long dynamic. As indicated by the last 20 or so minutes, there are a lot of things to talk about when it comes to these two characters. So much so that it's hard to write a conclusion that covers it all, but I think it's best to end on this point. Ultimately, Teen Titans is a show about heroes, something emphasized by the fact that we never see these characters out of costume, and throughout nearly every episode, there's some kind of discussion about what makes each of these 5 characters heroes. And I'm not sure, out of everything that the show does, that anything is as effective at doing such than taking Robin, the epitome of heroism, and pitting him against a character that, outside of his villainy, is immensely similar. As I've mentioned over and over and over again in this video, these two characters have a litany of things in common, from both fighting in the same way, to both getting easily obsessed, to both doing some objectively good and some objectively bad things. But despite all of this, these characters have one key difference. And while the end of the first season frames this as Robin having friends and Slade being alone, I think it can be better summarized as Robin lives for others and Slade lives for himself. When Robin does good things, like saving Raven, or bad things, like lying to his friends about Red X, it's ultimately, at least in his mind, to help others. And when Slade does good things, such as helping the Titans during the end of the world, or bad things, such as pretty much everything else, it's ultimately to benefit himself. And that's the main difference between the heroes and the villains of this show, exemplified nowhere better than in the immensely well done and entertaining series-long struggle between Robin and Slade. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to anybody who's gotten this far in the video, as putting this much time into a non-SU and non-AT video is definitely a bit risky, so I'm glad that at least one person somewhat enjoyed it. I know I've already alluded to it, but if you are interested in this style of video for the Terra arc, please let me know down in the comments. And if you want a more direct way than the comments to tell me how I misinterpreted the entire show, then you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been Ample Samuel, and I'll see you in probably like a week. Thanks for watching.